Good morning. This is John Gessler with Murfreesboro Live for the Main Street Show. We're here at Paw Bunk's, just on the Murfreesboro Square, on this Veterans Day 2014. Welcome, Mr. Butcher.
Thanks, John. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation to be with you here.
Thank you. I'd like to mention, of course, Corey is going to walk by here a second. He is Army, and he is a veteran, and owns Paw Bunks, who lets us use his facility. So I know there's a little bit of inner service or
well, there is.
Rivalry.
The Air Force used to be part of the Army, but we learned a little better to operate our own thing. So we separated in 1947 and became a separate service.
And so Corey allowed us to put the Air Force banner up, but he said it needs to come down pretty fast.
Only for this time.
But Mr. Butcher, can you tell us what led you to writing the book that really, Corey introduced us, so we may be picking on the Army and the Air Force off and on. My dad was Air Force for a couple of years. But for the book, 60 Years in the 20th Century, a Pilot's Memoir, obviously you weren't a pilot in the Air Force for 60 years, but what brought about writing the book?
Well, we all have a story, John. You have a story, I had a story, everyone has a story. And unfortunately, we don't always tell each other our stories. We meet someone, we have very shallow relationships for the most part. Plus, my children and grandchildren, they're so busy with their lives and so busy with all the electronics that we have out there today that they never sit down and ask questions. So part of the reason I wrote this book was for my children, my grandchildren, and those to come who one day might want to know what my life was spent. So I was born in 1939. I retired from my aviation job with Delta Airlines in 1999. And so that 60-year period not only represented my life, but it represented a tremendous number of changes in our society. And I was there for all of that. And I just thought that it would be interesting to someone to look at that period of time to see all of the events that took place.
Well, that brings us, I read some reviews on the book. Of course, it said Corey introduced me or told me about you on Friday. So it was a little bit short time, but I want to read a snippet, and I don't know where this came from, Google or Amazon, but one of the places that we can get your book.
Right, Amazon.com. Yes,
one person wrote, I enjoyed the entire book. I'm the same age as Captain Butcher, and I grew up near Knoxville, Tennessee, therefore experiencing much of the same things and going to some of the same places he did. I'm going to kind of read a little bit into what he said. I'm not going to quote him. He also worked at Delta for 32 years. And this is one thing I find interesting because I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. through high school and college years. And one of the pilots that we knew we went to church with, he worked for an airline that's no longer in service.
right.
But this is one thing he said. I can relate to one special flight that I never shall forget. It was a Delta departure from Dallas. And I've flown out of DFW Love Field several times. Captain Butcher at the controls. It was a dinner flight and nonstop. I think all flights should be nonstop.
Absolutely.
But, and that old saying is, I grew up flying on Allegheny, a couple of the other ones. Any was it landing you can walk away from is a good one or something like that?
We have a lot of good sayings like that. And incidentally, there were a lot of great airlines who went by the wayside, due to the economy, due to the changing legislation that we had.
But here, this person reviewing your book, 60 years in the 20th century of pilots, 60 years in the 20th century of pilot's memoir. You're at the controls, watched you roll down the runway, as 1,000 times in my career. It was the only flight of its nature, as most planes when taking off would take off sharp in a sharp upward angle with much power. And if they need to, they turn and bank with one wing lower and sharp turn. But his takeoff, being yours, was almost level, a gradual ascent. Very steady and moderate speed, and then he turned towards west of Dallas. Not with a bank, but with a completely level turn. I asked Captain sometime later about this takeoff, and he knows that it was a dinner flight, and you were able to give the people a smooth takeoff. And I don't think that people understand when you're flying how much the takeoff and landings can affect the value of air travel to the people like me that fly.
Absolutely. I always wanted to make it appear to the people in back that we never left the ground and we never got back.
Well, when we first moved to Washington, what I was going to tell you is when I saw this, one that stuck in mind, the guy that we went to church with, he took Eastern Airlines when he worked with.
Great airline at one time, yes.
And we took off out of Reagan National, now it's called Reagan. And he did about the same thing you did. He left it up. Now, he had a little bit more constraints because of the restricted airspace.
Right, the White House is real close there.
Yes. And the 14th Street Bridge and all the rest of it. And the other monuments, and then the USA Today building is down there on the left if you're going out that way.
Yeah, you get a whole tour there on takeoff or landing.
Well, he took us up nice and easy, flew us around Washington nice and easy. We came in up the Potomac on the Maryland side, right? And we were able to listen to the air tower traffic over the PA.
Right.
When we landed, and I was in high school and I was an only child, so I was lucky enough to fly quite frequently with my parents. And so we had not as many hours as some, but quite a few air miles.
Right.
And I leaned over to my dad and I said, have we touched down? Because we've landed there several times. And over the intercom, the air traffic control tower, I guess then they were still towers, mentioned something about, and you guys have a nice coy way of saying certain things, but meaning put the brakes on, your wheels are down.
Right.
Because at the end of that runway, you either stop or go fishing.
That's exactly right. There's not a lot of room to spare there. Well, as pilots, we always prided ourselves on our landings particularly. A good one we'd call a grease job because it's just like you're greasing the tires on.
Yeah.
But sometimes when the runway was short and the winds were against us, so to speak, we had to put the airplane on the ground, and a lot of times that was not a pleasant experience for either the pilots or the passengers.
Well, I don't know if you ever landed in Grand Junction, Colorado.
I had that in my Jefferson charts, and I was qualified in there, but I never did land there. It was sort of a seasonal location.
We lived there, and they take those hops on the old turboprops from Denver, the old location.
Right.
The book cliffs are on one side, and the mesas on the other. It's in a valley.
Yes.
And depending, I guess, on the winds, they'd come up over the mesa, and boy, they put that plane
down.
They put it on the ground.
You did what you had to do.
And then, of course, when we fly from Grand Junction to Denver, sometimes it felt like those pilots were bouncing from one mountaintop to the other because of the turbulence.
A lot of turbulence over there, a lot of mountain wave over that action. I've seen the airplane do weird things coming over the Rockies there.
And when they got the jets, it was a little smoother.
Oh, absolutely. You get above all of that pretty rapidly, yes.
But it was a 5 or more hour drive. And I think with a turboprop, it was less than an hour, right at an hour.
Yeah.
And the jets took it down to about 45 minutes or so.
Right. Speed is something, when the airlines first started out, it might take you 2 or 3 days to go transcontinental. But now I think they've got it down. I remember one flight I took off out of San Francisco to New York. I had a very good tailwind in excess of 100 miles an hour. And we made it in about 5.5 hours.
Oh, wow.
From San Francisco to New York.
We were watching, coincidentally, we took a trip with the children back to outside Washington a couple of years ago, and at Dulles Airport, they have the Smithsonian building that was built there in 2000.
Right, a lot of airplanes in there.
And they have the Black Hawk, or that one black I forgot the name of the spy plane.
Oh, the SR-72, the Blackbird.
Yeah, Black.
Right.
It's there in that facility.
Yes.
And they said that when it flew there from California, because they could land right at Dulles, that it was either 52 or 62 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
But that was a record-breaking speed. But they wouldn't tell you how fast it could have made
Could
it.
have made it. Right. Yeah. Those airplanes were designed for a different mission than hauling passengers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was sorry to see the Concorde had those problems and it blew up. And I wish they would have been able to. The economy and fuel and all the other
Right.
things.
Yeah, I covered this in my book about the SSTs. America had the opportunity to build one, but it was during the Jimmy Carter days, and civil aviation was not one of the favorite fair-haired industries at that time. So he refused to build it. So it was left to the British and the French to build it. Yeah. Fine airplane, had a little niche market, but probably not anything that would produce a profit for anybody.
But that was certainly, we've flown from New York to Brussels,
Right.
and then from Chicago to Tokyo.
It's a good run.
And both of those, well, I would have liked to stop at Cloud 9 and stretched out once or twice.
Right.
But we went on through.
It's a long flight. Some of those flights out west, you're fighting the headwinds, and but fortunately, you've got aircraft that can carry enough fuel to go nonstop without having to stop on some little island out there somewhere.
Well, real quick, you're right, and we'll get back to some of the stuff because I am interested in your life in history. But it's neat talking about the flights. We have flown from Miami to Los Angeles, and we've done some longer flights, and we've done some short ones. My dad worked for an airline for a short period of time. We could go from here to Washington,
Right.
and it was Delta, and we could go from here to Delta on one of those puddle jumpers, and it was about an hour and a half or so flight, and we could be in Washington. We'd leave at 4. I guess we'd leave at 6 o'clock from Nashville. We'd spend the day in Washington, and we'd fly back. And we were back home in our bed at night.
It's very hard for
That
people to
would stick.
understand that. I was always fascinated with the distances that aircraft could cover, and how things have changed, in just a few years, actually. Going all the way back to the covered wagons that took months, and now you're talking hours. In the case of the SR-72, minutes.
Yes. But I would like to, for the people that would like, here's the cover of the book. Here's something you wrote in this engaging memoir. The author, or I guess you didn't write this.
No,
The author presents a slice of life, and this is what I'd like to note. My daughter likes military history, and she's fairly young, and so she's read some books, and we've had to kind of pick and choose what she reads because of some of the things that the authors. It's war.
Yeah,
included,
right.
But at different ages, there's
there's a coarseness that runs through the military that I don't know how you get rid of it. But
well,
you
yeah.
have to. I have a book called Baba Black Sheep that was written about a World War II memoir, and it's a pretty coarse language book, but that's the way it was. If something is that way, then you don't want to
You can't change history.
dress it up too much.
And although some people try now, but what I'm trying to say is how this book is somewhat, it's at a different, comes from a different perspective. It doesn't change what happened. I think the earlier chapters you wrote when you were in Vietnam, how they were training you guys to avoid the enemy, and you stayed over, let the other guys and the natives got their hats and $100 a hat.
Right.
And you came in and eventually. But that's a good. I won't tell how that particular training ended,
Right.
but it was a good part of the book. And look, and a man in his times in the last 60 years of the 20th century. Follow along as the story unfolds. Concurrent, and this is I think the neat part. Concurrent with and guided by the events in our nation's history, But sometimes people exclude and they miss why you're doing different things in parts of history. From his days as a boy growing up in rural Tennessee, to the air war in Vietnam, to the captain's pilot seat in one of the nation's premier airlines, and then skipping down. Here's a little bit about you, so you might find this interesting, or you can check out during this next paragraph. Either one. Mr. Butcher has a BA degree from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he was designated as a distinguished military candidate of the AFROTC. Of course, for those Air Force ROTC,
as opposed to the Army
ROTC.
Right.
And that's what is, for those who don't know, it's ROTC is the
Reserve Officers Training Command.
There's a lot of people put corps there. It's
Right.
command program. He also holds an AS degree in aviation administration from Georgia State University in Atlanta. Now you reside here in Middle Tennessee with your wife, and I'm fortunate enough to talk to you on this Veterans Day. But I appreciate the book that you've written, and like I said, I've been through and I've kind of read different parts of it. I was trying to speed read, so I've missed some things here and there. But as we go through, we can talk a little bit about the book. And again, it's right here is one location people can purchase it at Paul Bunk.
Right. I keep a copy or two here, and then Hastings has 2 or 3 of the copies.
And that's just up on Memorial.
Right. And I've had one book signing, and I'm scheduling another one for the library, and then another one at Hastings next year.
So maybe if you let us know when that's on, we can put that on our site, Murfreesboro Live,
Yes.
and at least have the advertising out there.
That's great.
Can you tell me about your roots? Of course, we talked about a little bit of rural Tennessee, but how does that help bring you up and get you to Knoxville?
Well, of course, I was born in 1939, September 24th, and ironically, 23 days prior is when Hitler decided to launch his attack on Poland and begin World War II. So I always advertised myself as one of the first war babies. But my dad was he was a military man. He volunteered for the Navy. He was a gunnery instructor. They said that he was such a good shot. I guess he got that hunting squirrels or something, that they kept him as a gunnery instructor. He was married with children, so he didn't see any action, but he was training the guys to go into action. But he grew up there in just north of Knoxville, Tennessee, a place called Hall's Crossroads, and went through all of my primary and high school there at Hall's High School, and ended up at the University of Tennessee. And at that time, the university was what they call a land grant college. In other words, they had the ROTC programs. They had the Air Force and the Army. Some schools had Navy, but we only had the Air Force and the Army. And so I had a choice of which one I wanted to take. So I ran into one of my friends one day, and I said, "What should I do? Get in the Army or the Air Force?" He says, "Get in the Air Force." He said, "If you don't, you'll have to carry a rifle." And so that's exactly how I came into the Air Force ROTC.
A lot of planning in there, huh?
A lot of planning, and well, it's just God guiding me down through, His perfect will, I guess. But anyway, I went through the Air Force ROTC program. The first 2 years were basic; those were required to graduate. But I sort of liked the military. I liked the sort of cut and dried. You knew where you stood. Who was rank was everything, and so I went into what they call the advanced program, and that led me into pilot training. And I was able to get my private license by flying a little Super Cub, little Piper Cub around, and that just led me right on into being commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force, and then going into 53 weeks of pilot training. And just carrying that on, I graduated from pilot training, got my wings at Craig Air Force Base down in Selma, Alabama. And then I finished like number 5 out of 50 guys, something like that. And my instructor wanted me to take a fighter assignment. But an old instructor of mine said, no. He said, don't do that. He said, get out into the big Air Force, get a lot of flying time and see the world. So I went to C-130s in Military Air Transport Service. Strangely, I went through primary training on the C-130 right out here at Seward Air Force Base in Smyrna. So that's where I started. And then right on into my tour of duty at Travis Air Force Base, flying a Pacific in C-130s. And then one day I walked into the operations officer's office, and he said, "We need some volunteers to go to a place called Vietnam." And I was real happy where I was. I said, "Well, what if I don't volunteer?" He said, "Well, you'll go as a non-volunteer." And I aspired to be a career officer at that time, so I said, "Well, I volunteered." And so next thing I knew, I went through survival training in Panama and some other schools that I went through, and then I went to C-123s, Air Commandos, in Vietnam. And I was there for a year, flew over 300 combat support missions, and came back from there to the Air Training Command as an instructor, teaching other pilots how to fly. And then one day I looked around and saw that all the really sharp guys were beginning to look at the airlines. And military is a good career, you're taken care of, but normally when you hit about 40 years old, you're eligible for retirement, and then you're out on the labor market without any skills other than what you had when you finished your military tour. So I started looking at the airlines, and I just hit it lucky with Delta Airlines. They were hiring very heavily at the time, and went with them in 1969 and retired in 1999, 30 years. Started off as a flight engineer, went to co-pilot, worked my way up on the bigger airplanes because we were paid according to the size of the airplane. And then I had to go back to the little ones as a captain and work my way up to Boeing 767 captain, where I retired. Interesting, in the end of the book is my retirement flight, which my wife accompanied me on, and she was in the cockpit as we taxied back in on my last flight. The guys at the firehouse, they always had the fire engine pumpers out there pumping arc of water, one on each side. So I taxied through that, and arrived at the gate, and just walked off. I was 60 years old. I couldn't fly anymore. They can go to 65 now, but 60 years, and I was done. So I walked off the airplane, and I haven't flown since. Not as a pilot.
Now, can you teach that right here at the Murfreesboro Airport then?
Well,
at
my age now, I wouldn't qualify. Probably there's an age limit and a physical limit, but I would have to be something like a ground instructor or something like that, rather than. And in fact, I went out and sat in one of the little trainers one day, and my size is not what it used to be. I don't fit in those little cockpits quite as well. But it's been an interesting career, and I just praise the Lord that I've been able to do it.
Well, let's go back in time a little bit. What was it like growing up in the 50s? And the reason I'm asking this question, we've talked some before the show, but in the late 70s, early 80s, which is sometime after the 50s, I will certainly grant, we lived out west in a small town in Arizona, and also in Grand Junction, reverse border. And we had a square similar to the one here in Prescott. And we moved from there to Washington, D.C.
It's a big transition.
That was almost culture shock.
It was, yeah.
But when we moved to Washington, outside in Fairfax County in Springfield, when I went to school in high school, they said, "Did you have cable or TV out there?" And we lived at Fort Whipple, was the VA facility. We lived on base. Of course, that was when they were still, it was in the early 1900s when those homes were built on the ground. Mm-hmm. And when the VA took it over, they used what was the officers' quarters. and those are neat homes.
Yes.
But that was when they were still fighting the Indians
Right.
out
right.
there.
Yeah.
And so I said, no, we still had the wood fence around the fort,
Stockade.
stockade style fencing. And they joked with me every once in a while about that. And then real quick, we have some family land in northeastern Kentucky near Beattyville. And when my children go back, they go, boy, and nothing really has changed there. Although the IGA did burn and they built a new one. And they said, boy, this is like living in the 60s.
Absolutely. Right. There are places where you can return to those days. You know, not many. It's hard to go anywhere where you don't find a McDonald's or a Kentucky Fried Chicken.
But what was it like growing up in the
50s? If you get my book, you'll notice that I titled that chapter "Happy Days." I know there was a TV show called The Happy Days, but they really were the happy days. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the president. We were just coming out of World War II. Everybody was building. People were buying homes, and they were building great cars, which are all classics today. You know, rock and roll came in. We thought that was the greatest thing. You know, Elvis and all of that.
Elvis the Pelvis?
Yeah. The big thing, though, John, was that girls were girls and boys were boys. There wasn't anything in between. If you understand what I'm saying.
I'm not that old. I'm half a 90, but I do relate.
Boys were boys and girls were girls, and you know, there was a lot of talk about things going on, but it was mostly talk. You know, it was an innocent age. I think if I had to describe it, a very innocent age. No drugs. The worst thing you could do, perhaps, was get some older boy to buy you a beer or something like that. You know, or maybe sneak around behind the gym and smoke a cigarette. I mean, that was real heavy sin back in those days, you know. So,
my dad said if you were caught smoking or chewing gum in the bathroom, that was
and we respected authority. That was a big thing. We respected those who had the authority over us. And today, I just feel so sorry for the young people because they've missed out on so much with all the social media and all of the moral decline in the country. And, but it was just a happy time. A very, very, very good time that I doubt we'll ever see again. I was just glad to be part of it.
I tend to agree. Our children go to a small county school here in Rutherford County, and they could have gone to one of the big high schools. We chose to put them in. They're not going to go. And part of that is they still have discipline at this particular school, and it is. We've nicknamed it Mayberry.
Absolutely.
But that being said, when they come home, they do their homework, and their phones are turned off at a certain time, and their friends will ask them, "What about?" And they say, "Mom and Dad said no." And they'll say, "Well, what are you going to do? Why can't you?" And they said no.
Right.
And I'm an only child. So Mom and Dad would double team me. When they said no, I knew
it was no.
That was a no.
Well, a lot of kids today don't take no for an answer.
When you were growing up, what did you do? Like you mentioned social media. I've seen some emails, probably like you have, that our social media when I was growing up was the sandlot or the bicycles on the way to school.
Right.
But that's much newer. I mean, you were...
Well, we did so many things. Just as a younger boy, we swam in the creek. You know, we dammed the creek up and went swimming in the summertime. We found grapevines up on the side of the hill that we could swing on. We built little go-karts and raced them around. You know, and then we got into sports with basketball. We always had a sandlot baseball game going on of some kind, boys and girls. We all played together, and riding our bicycles, and just so much outdoors. My mother would send me out the door in the morning, and I might not even come back until evening meal. You know, and I can remember her blowing the horn, telling me, "Hey, it's time to come in." I might be a quarter mile over in the field somewhere. But we rode horses, played cowboy. We just did so many things outdoors, climbing trees, you name it.
As you grew up and did that, and we talked a little bit about going to college at UT. After that, what was it like when you did end up in the Air Force? Of
Well,
course, that was a time where Vietnam was a turbulent time in our nation's history if you were in the military.
right.
And that was more near the end of Vietnam.
Right. I went in, I was commissioned in 1961, and the big thing that hit us right off the bat was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was going through pilot training, and I remember we went into some code yellows there, not knowing what was going to happen with that situation. And fortunately, the Russian ships who were carrying missiles to be set up in Cuba turned back, and due to John F. Kennedy, he put Strategic Air Command on alert. And I think they were ready to do whatever needed to be done to keep those missiles out of Cuba.
If we could take a distraction today, because I was talking when I was a paper boy.
Well, I was too.
That was how you made your money back then.
Exactly.
I think I made it a little bit more probably in the late 70s than you did.
Right.
But I made a whole $30-some a month with about 30-some to 50, 60 papers. It went up a little bit.
Well, it taught you responsibility, getting up and carrying those papers,
One of my houses I delivered to, he was one of Patton's colonels.
Mm-hmm.
And he would tell me the stories. And we lived on Fort Whipple, the base there.
Right.
We weren't allowed as children to go down to where the men lived on the station or being the hospital. So we followed those directions. No, we still went down there. We found out what the canteen was. We thought that was those lead-based things that we weren't allowed to drink with.
Yeah.
We got a Coke and a candy bar for 50 cents. The canteen was a place. But we would sit with some of the, and at the time, World War I and II veterans and listen to the stories of the war then.
Right.
Where I'm going with, you said about the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was and we talked about earlier, authority. There was a time in this country when the U.S. or somebody with authority said no. Even on, and I don't want to get into necessarily the Democrat or the Republican issue, but you're right. John F. Kennedy, he was the president, and he was in the Democratic Party.
Right.
And we can debate whether how much they've changed from where they were and what he would be now.
Right.
But what do you think the difference is fighting some of the, they call them conflicts. I say if we go out somewhere and shoot, you're at war. But I've never been in the military. I took a test to get in. For sports injuries, they didn't want me.
Yeah.
But what do you think that the authority has changed in the way that, and the leadership of America, both military and civilian? Because at the time, a lot of the people went from the military to a political office.
Right. Can I hold that thought?
Sure.
While we take a little break?
Yeah.
Would that be okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, we can't pause it. This is live. Sorry. I don't know.
Can I take a quick break?
Sure.
Maybe you can.
We'll fill in here.
Rephrase that question.
Okay. As we're on a commercial break. What we will be talking about is, like what we talked about, is what did he do when he grew up, Mr. Butcher? How did he end up in the Air Force? And then that question I asked, some of the difference between the military and civilian leadership today versus what it was, and talk about the book being congruent with him growing up and being out of the college into Vietnam and then into his flight as a pilot and the civilian side. What was it like going through Air Force pilot training? I think that would be interesting for us to know as well. What bases or where was some of his assignments as in the Air Force? Is we need to understand sometimes we think of the Air Force as all as fighter pilots. The fighter pilots, of course, need the support and logistics of planes and fuel and weapon systems and more bullets and bombs and the rest of it. And the crews that take care of that pilot's plane that they're going to go out and fly a sortie. I'm going to ask him a little more about his tour in Vietnam, and then why to leave the Air Force. We touched a little bit about that. And then a little bit about his civilian air service and his time in the civilian part of our nation's air fleet.
Sorry, I had to take a break there.
No worries.
These old bodies, sometimes certain medications cause you to do certain things. So I'm back.
My mom calls them bio breaks.
There you go. You were talking about the change in authority between today and back then.
And the reason I asked, of course, our children will still say yes, sir, and no, sir.
Right.
And I was reminded when I was a child, if I didn't call somebody yes, sir, no, thank you, or please, thank you, with a rap on the bottom of the pants or the back of the head.
Well, I think you hit on it, John. It goes back to the home. You know, home today is nothing like the home that I grew up in, or that you grew up in, or that you're trying to maintain with your children. The home now is people scattering, doing different things, rarely coming together, maybe for Thanksgiving or Christmas or something like that, rarely coming together as a family. And so the whole breakdown of the family, I think, is where it starts. And then as people get older, there's more of a rebellious attitude. You know, I'm going to do my thing, and not a whole lot of respect for other people.
Yeah, I told my parents,
just keeps going up.
When I have children, I'm going to do things different.
Right.
No, I didn't do things much different.
You found out your dad was smarter than you thought he was.
Yes, right. I do have very good parents, and I think they're probably going to be watching this later. They're at a Veterans Day ceremony with my daughter for a choir, singing about the Grendel flag.
Amen. Right.
So continue on.
Well, I'm just thinking that a lot of difference. Say when you put a Ronald Reagan against a
Jimmy Carter that gave up the canal.
Yeah, it's just a different mindset now, and our country is no longer as heterogeneous as it was at one time. We're a mixed multitude of different people with different ideas about how things need to be done, having different schedules that they're trying to advance. And, I think that's worked to our disadvantage.
We were talking about how you ended up in the Air Force. And in the beginning of the show, we talked some about, and we've got a couple of minutes left, but we talked about how, the one guy said you have to carry the rifle of the Army, and if you go to the Air Force and something else. But after that decision was made, and you were going through the Air Force and their training and those, can you tell us what led you to stay in the Air Force? Because you mentioned you wanted to stay as a career officer.
Right. Well, I started off as a distinguished military graduate. I was offered a regular commission, which entitles you, if you keep your nose clean, to a full career, perhaps advancing as far as general, even with the potential of becoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The sky was the limit for a regular officer versus a reserve officer, which most of the men were commissioned in the reserve. I was commissioned in the regular.
Oh, okay.
So that gave me a tremendous advantage, and I set out to have a career. As I said earlier, it's a good career in many ways, but as far as the economic aspects of it and the uncertainty of where you're going to be stationed and that type of thing, it didn't provide the stability that I needed at the time.
Well, and people have said, and after, like I said, growing up in Fairfax County, we knew the generals. We went to church with higher ranking officers. The difference was that they'd say they gave up 2 lifetimes. They'd miss their family's vacations and stuff like that, and go on their own.
Thank you for your service.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
God bless you. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for doing that.
I always accept that for all veterans. My war, Vietnam, there was 50-some thousand who didn't come back. So If you've never been to the memorial in Washington, if you've been there, it's very, very emotional, particularly for someone whose name should have been.
And let's take a maybe chase a rabbit for a second because of what you said about the Vietnam Memorial. We've gone to Arlington Cemetery many times, and at the Tomb of the Unknown, where they do the ceremony during the daytime hours. But that same ceremony where those three men are switching out the guard 24 hours a day, whether it's a nice afternoon or a nice evening, snow, rain, heat, and hurricanes, whatever weather is going on, that happens. And those men do that. We were there a couple of years ago in Washington. It was one of the hottest summers on history. It was the end of May. And we had just walked from Jefferson across the bridge through the gates of the Arlington, and then did the walk from the thing all the way up that hill to where Lee's mansion now, right?
Well, Custis Mansion.
Yeah, and I had two children with me, and they were 9 and 10, I believe, at the time, something like that. They were a little bit tired. Not to mention, I was a little tired.
Right. Hills get a little bit steeper as you get over.
When I was there, they weren't that high. I think they've raised them.
Right.
But as we did that, we sat down on the steps. Just as we got there, they started the changing of the guard. And I told Aaron and Jenna, stand up. And they looked at me like I had three heads. I looked at them, and they stood up, and they weren't slouching like I am now. Hardly anybody else stood up. Finally, the person that tells, I guess he's a sergeant probably, that tells what's going to happen.
Right.
He asked everybody to stand up. They slowly got up.
Right.
We stood during the ceremony, and it was done, and everybody was sat down. Aaron and Jenna wanted. I go, no, stand up. Because they haven't gone around the side of the building yet. Right. And as we were leaving, the one guy had come back out, and he kind of nodded. Now, there was hundreds of people there, but he nodded to Aaron and Jenna, but they stood up.
For showing respect, yeah. Well, a lot of the people there were probably tourists. Maybe they didn't understand the significance of what was going on and the honor that needed to be shown.
You're a little more generous than I am.
Well, you see it everywhere, where it's ball games or, they play the national anthem. People don't know unless they're told to stand up, they won't, and they
move their hats,
put their hand over their heart, whatever. And you almost have to force people to be patriotic sometimes.
Well, let's go here real quick. We'll finish a little more about your book, because I think these things, I would like the book to do well.
Right.
But of course, today is more of your service and about you. But it's helping with someone's imagination, or takes their time to read it, because like I said at the beginning, I really believe it's a different type of story than we see in most books about someone's military and life and career.
Right. I tried to center my book around the social changes that were going on. Not so much about any individual missions that I flew, although there are some things in the book about those, but it's a life that was lived over those 60 years of a lot going on, and that's the main point of the book.
We left a little bit how you got into the Air Force. What was it like going through Air Force pilot training?
Wow, Air Force pilot training. 53 weeks of total pressure. The pressure never let up. I finished all of my checks at the end, and my squadron commander said, well, I had one left, I believe it was, and my commander said, well, Lieutenant Butcher, have you got it made? And I said, no, sir, I've never got it made until they pin those wings on it. And that was the happiest day, one of the happiest days of my life.
I couldn't imagine what it'd be like to actually earning your wings, because when we were growing up, when you walk off the plane, the pilots would give you the plastic wings.
Right. Well, we remember they're plastic.
Well, yeah, but you did a lot more to get yours than us as a child walking off the plane, and the pilot would give us a token.
Yeah, it was total pressure for whole time. We had academics in the morning, flying in the evening. The next week we'd fly in the morning, have academics in the evening. The instructors were just on us, and I got to see it from both sides because I came back as an instructor, and I remembered when I was a student. I'm afraid I was a little too easy, maybe on some of the guys, but they were there to prepare us to, and I hate to use these terms, to fly and fight and kill the enemy. That's what they told us. And that's what we're doing. They're doing it right now over in Iraq with ISIS and all that. They're killing the enemy right now.
Well, we'll stick with the book.
Right.
I know that you said it hasn't been so much about your particular assignments, but what were some of your assignments as a pilot in the Air Force?
Well, like I said, I started off in C-130s. I was a transport pilot. And
Now, what did you guys carry in the C? And tell because most of us don't know what a C-130
C-130 is a 4-engine turboprop. It's built by Lockheed out of Marietta, Georgia. In my unit, we went down there and had brand new airplanes that came right off the assembly line. It used a rail system that carried pallets. And we carry anything that would go on a pallet, they throw a net over it, they slide it in there and lock it in place, and we take off. Most of our flights were all westbound out of Travis Air Force Base in California. We stopped in Hawaii, refuel. Sometimes we go on to Wake Island, carrying supplies, just a little bit, whatever needed to be carried, we carried it. And it was a great airplane, still is a great airplane. I've got about 3,000 hours of C-130 time, and got to see a lot of the world. We also had a tactical mission as well, dropping troops, dropping equipment over drop zones. One I recall was called Operation Delaware, where we worked with back when the Shah of Iran was in charge. He was a great friend of ours. We worked with him on some joint operations where we dropped troops and dropped equipment onto these drop zones to show our capability of responding to these little flash fire wars that would come up.
Tell me about some of your times when you were in Vietnam.
Well, I got there in June of 1965, and of course I was assigned to a squadron and began what they call a theater checkout, where I had to fly into all these various landing fields that we had. Some of them were, they just...
and those landing fields had nice concrete and asphalt runways.
I never saw any concrete except back at Saigon. They'd grade off the top of a mountain and call us in the next week to land. I landed on city streets. I landed at night with flashlights, defining the outlines of the runways. A lot of our flying were what we call flare missions. They had this concept called strategic hamlet, where they would set up a defense perimeter around a little town, and we'd go up over the town and drop out these flares. There's one story in my book about the night that the flare went off back in the cargo compartment, and how we were ready to bail out if we didn't get that flare out of the cargo compartment.
Fires on ships and planes are not good.
Fire is not good. That's about the only reason I'd jump out of an airplane would be if it was on fire. I always wonder about these guys that go out and skydive, just for the fun of it. I never thought I'd want to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. I mean, if it was...
I've got a buddy that does that.
If it's on fire or, spinning toward the ground or something, I'd probably want to jump in. I never had the... in fact, I hate to admit it, but I was always a little scared of high places. Even though I'd be at 41,000 feet, I'd say, I'm way up here, but I had an airplane under me, so I was okay.
In the short time we have left, we talked a little bit about the age limit of the Air Force at the time, but why did you leave the Air Force?
Well, like I said, I enjoyed flying. Flying is what I wanted to do. And when you reach a certain point in the Air Force, they want you to fly a desk instead of flying airplanes. And I didn't look forward to that. And that was one of the reasons I began to look at the airlines, because I could continue flying as a career.
Is that what they call flying a bus?
Right. Flying, well, you know, they call us bus drivers, but I'd like to see a bus driver out there with a ice-covered runway and the wind's almost out of limits for the crosswind, and see him put the bus on the runway. Yeah. So it's a little bit more than driving a bus. Yeah.
We had a friend, he was a fighter pilot. His buddy was an airline pilot
Right.
who had been a fighter pilot.
Right.
And they would joke around quite a bit.
Well, you do one for fun, the other for money. You know, it's
Oh.
yeah, yeah, it's kind of like that.
So when you left the Air Force and you became a Delta pilot,
Right.
you were still doing good service for people. But like
Right.
like that review said, I don't know, I look at things a little bit differently maybe than some, in that review stuck to me because you cared about people who were flying in your plane. Rather, you're getting paid, like you
Right.
say, you did one for fun, maybe one for money.
Right.
But I think the character shows where you do something for someone else because people expect one thing and they get something else that has more value to it.
Right.
And when I was going through the book, I think that was one of the things that I noticed differently. The tone of the book was much different. It seems like there's more of a caring or a character involved.
Well, I'd like to think so. You know, when you're dealing with people's lives, it's a tremendous responsibility. And even though the fighter pilots out there, protecting the country militarily, those for the airlines have a responsibility of moving people from point A to point B in a safe manner. And I was always proud of the record that we had on the airlines. I mean, we have had some accidents from time to time, but when you look at the number of miles that are flown by the number of people who fly, it's probably the safest mode of transportation that you could ever have. I was always proud to be associated with the airline pilots as a group, the Airline Pilots Association, which is sort of a loose union that we had. I was always very proud to wear my Alpha pin to indicate the professionalism that we ascribe to.
I have to respectfully end the show here pretty soon. I
Oh,
have
it's-
other things to do.
Yeah, well, I've really enjoyed it, John, and if you want to go to part 2 sometime, we'd be glad to do that.
Yeah,
I just enjoy talking, as you might tell. My dad had a little bit of a tendency to be a talker and a storyteller, and maybe I picked up a little bit of that.
Well, the purpose for Murfreesboro Live website and then the Main Street show, which we're on, is to highlight the local people and businesses of Rutherford County and Middle Tennessee. Now we will talk about politics, and we will branch out some.
Right.
But Middle Tennessee, of course, with Nissan and MTSU and the VA and other industries, there is a lot of international activity that happens here.
Right.
Also, we're in the middle of the country for the most part on the eastern side. You
Right.
get to most of the country in 11 hours.
Right.
But it is neat to talk about. We know Mr. and Mrs. Ledbetter. They own this shoe store just up here a little bit. You mentioned Binks. Corey,
Right.
of course, is a veteran that owns Paul Bunks here. But yes, if we could maybe talk about some of the boyhood. I don't know. I haven't talked to Truman Jones. He does a show on WGNS. And you may have heard some of his guests. But I find those shows interesting that tell about the way Murfreesboro was, or the 50s, or different time periods.
It's a great area right here. I was, of course, raised in Tennessee, East Tennessee, and I used to kid people about living in other areas of Tennessee. I always said that Tennessee actually ended at Rockwood, and that the rest of the state was just eastern Arkansas. But I've changed my mind about that. I love Middle Tennessee, and Murfreesboro. I mean, it's a perfect city as far as the size. It's growing. There's going to be problems, but a lot of good people here, like you say, from around the world. You know, we've got the Muslims here. We've got the different racial groups represented here throughout the county. And, just an exciting time for Middle Tennessee.
And like you say, we've got the county and city mayor. They do what they can.
Right.
The local police chief and the sheriff,
Right.
they try the best with how they're governed in there
Yeah,
to keep us safe. And then you just have good people here that want to do what's right for the
Exactly.
most part.
Right.
And sometimes, hopefully, the people that don't, we can discourage to do it somewhere else because
Hopefully.
they may not change, but maybe we can change their
Right.
location.
Well, you're going to have that element anywhere you go, and with the government here, they do a great job, and that's where government really has its most of its impact is on the local level. That's
Yeah.
that's where we need to keep it.
And maybe too, we can do a part two and have a format, or we could just chase rabbits for a little bit. I think one neat thing is you mentioned about the book and kind of why you wrote it is earlier in the show. It's for your children and grandchildren.
Yes.
They'll know a little bit about Grandpa.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I hope that these shows, they are archived and all the rest of it, that people can go back and listen to. And
Well, it's funny you should say that. There's a channel on TV I love to watch. It's called American Hero Channel, and they go back and they interview most of the people that passed on now, but they talk about their experiences in World War II and all of that, and that needs to be archived and referred to from time to time.
and maybe even if you have some friends that have a story to tell, or we do have the ability to have multiple cameras. Maybe if you had a friend and you want to tell fishing stories, those shows are, I think they're entertaining. We can look at our Google Analytics and we can see if a show has been entertaining. And so far, everyone has been. I think there's I think it's right at 9,000 views.
Wow.
So I want to do things that are entertaining but add value, and then I want to make sure that for my time too, that if we're doing something, we need to do it right.
Exactly. Well, people are entertaining in themselves. You know, I'm kind of a person. I can't go through the checkout line of the grocery store without talking to the guy behind me or the person in front of me. You know, and finding out a little bit about them because people are just so interesting to me.
But maybe we can do that at a time. I appreciate your time with us, Mr. Butcher.
Okay, John, I appreciate it.
Hold on
very
1
much.
second. I'll
All right.
push the buttons and let the
Okay.
cameras do whatever it does, and then we'll.
Sorry for my little interlude there. But,
Oh, no, I took it as a commercial. I went over some of the
Okay,
things
good.
and the
All right.
logistics of what you guys may
Okay.
carry for the fighter pilots or the other people that need
Right.
to eat in the military.
There we go.
So,
Very well. Thanks
real
again.
quick, my uncle was what do they call it when they would make the runways for you guys?
So CVs
Yeah,
in the military,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And he would do that. He just passed away this summer from cancer. But he told stories. He wouldn't tell much, like most of you guys. He doesn't tell a lot of the different stories. But one time, if I could take a second, someone was shooting at him, a sniper.
Absolutely, yeah.
He lifted up the blade of that.
Ran him over.
Well, he made it so that the other people could take care of business.
Take care of business, right?
And then he
yeah.
went on to making a runway.
There's a movie called The Fighting CVs, and where they out on these Pacific islands, you know, and they weren't cleared of all the enemy.
Right.
And even though the enemy had been fairly cleared, there were always those Japanese still on the island who were ready to die for the emperor, you know, and they didn't hesitate to shoot and to continue fighting. In fact, they didn't find the last one on one of the islands out there until up in the 80s.
Yes, that's what I heard.
He hid out, you know, finally came out, you know.
And we forget that they were just as loyal to their country
Absolutely.
as we are to our flag.
Absolutely.
Right. And that colonel that was one of Patton's colonels, I believe in the movie, Pat, one of the things Patton said was if they want to die for their country, let them, and we'll
Right.
live for ours.
We'll live for ours. Yeah, that was a good line.
Yeah.
But they were ready. In fact, they, the kamikaze, they were ready to give their life to the emperor. And, when someone's as dedicated as that, you've got a real tough enemy
Yeah.
who's willing to die for what they believe.
And we're very fortunate that what would be our forefathers, for me, they were young, I'm much younger, but they and the people that are my age are doing it now. I wish our politicians were as honorable as some of the people in the military, because the military makes it so the politicians can do their job. And then, like you said, at the local level, we can live our lives. But we do have to, in my opinion, be grateful for the men and women in the armed forces.
Right. That's something that has changed so much, John. When I came back from Vietnam, there was no one there in the airport to shake our hand. No one there. In fact, they were saying some pretty bad things to us. Guys were being spit on. You couldn't believe what went on. But today, I'm glad to see the people beginning to appreciate the military.
But maybe that could be a different trend.
That's right. Okay.